have lived so long that people treat me like a monument. They come and they look and they say 102, as though the number itself is the thing worth knowing. It is not the thing worth knowing. The number is just arithmetic. What is worth knowing is what the number contains, and what it contains is a world that has died and been replaced so many times over that I sometimes feel less like a person and more like the last reader of a book that has gone out of print. My name is Agnes Violet Marsh. I was born on the 14th of April, 1872, in a village in Shropshire, England. I was the third of 5 children of a schoolmaster and his wife. We lived in a house without running water, without electric light, without a telephone, without an automobile, and without an aeroplane overhead. We did not even have a photograph of anyone in the family, because photographs were expensive and my father was not a wealthy man. I was born into a world lit by candles and oil lamps and the occasional luxury of gas. It was a world in which the speed of news was the speed of a horse or a train. A world in which the distance between one country and another was measured not in hours but in weeks. That world is gone as completely as Rome. I want to tell you about the changes, but I want to tell you about them honestly. That means I will not stand here at the end of my life and tell you that everything was better before. It was not all better before. Some of it was considerably worse. And the people who remember only the warmth of the old world are usually the people who were comfortable in it. And comfort has a way of editing what you choose to remember. The first change I remember noticing as a change was the electric light. We had gas lamps in the village from before I was born, but I was perhaps 12 or 13 when the first electric light appeared in the town 2 miles away. And my father took us to see it. We stood on the pavement outside a shop and looked at the light in the window. It was different from gas in a way that was difficult to articulate precisely. It was steadier. It was wider. It did not breathe the way gas light breathed, that slight living fluctuation that you stopped noticing until something removed it, and then you noticed the absence. The electric light was very still. I found it beautiful and slightly cold, and I think my 12-year-old response to it was not entirely wrong. Electric felt new and strange to me then. We had electric light in my own house by the time I was 23, after I had married and moved to Birmingham. By then I had already stopped thinking of it as remarkable. That is the speed at which human beings normalize the extraordinary. And I have watched it happen so many times across 100 years that I now think it is one of the most important things about us. We are creatures of the new normal. Whatever arrives, we absorb it and make it ordinary. And then we cannot imagine having lived without it. And then we stop being able to imagine the people who did live without it as fully real. That loss of imagination troubles me. Not the normalization itself, which is probably necessary for a species that needs to function rather than stand permanently in amazement, but the forgetting of what came before, the flattening of it into quaintness, the tendency to treat the past as a simpler place inhabited by simpler people. The people of 1872 were not simpler than the people of 1974. They were differently equipped and differently constrained, and the constraints were real and sometimes brutal, and the equipment was limited in ways that caused genuine suffering. But the inner life of a person in 1872 was not a simpler inner life. My mother was not a simpler person than my granddaughter. She was a more limited person in certain practical respects, and a more practiced person in others, and the difference between those things matters. Forgetting what came before blunts our understanding. My husband was a man named Edwin. We married in 1894, when I was 22 and he was 26, and we were together for 41 years until he died in 1935. He was an engineer by training and by disposition. which meant he was constitutionally incapable of encountering a new technology without wanting to understand exactly how it worked. Living with him across the decades of the most rapid technological change in human history was like living with a very cheerful and perpetually astonished encyclopedia. Edwin was among the first people in our street to ride a bicycle. He rode one in 1896 with the specific joy of a man who has been waiting for something to be invented and is delighted to discover it has been. He saw his first motor car in 1899 and spent 3 weeks talking about the engine. He flew in an aeroplane in 1921 when he was 53 years old on a passenger service between London and Paris that took 2.5 hours and cost more than our housemaid earned in a month. He came home and sat at the kitchen table and said very quietly that he had looked down at the channel from 2,000 feet and it had looked like a photograph of itself. Joy and wonder followed him home that day. I did not fly with him. I had my reasons, and I kept them. I watched Edwin embrace every new thing with an appetite I admired and did not always share. And I think the difference between us was not about courage, but about what each of us was paying attention to. Edwin watched what was arriving. I watched what was leaving. Both things were worth watching. Neither of us was wrong to watch the thing we watched. I watched leaving as carefully as he watched arriving. What was leaving? Let me try to tell you what was leaving. The quiet. I know that sounds like the complaint of an old woman, and perhaps it is, but I want to be precise about what I mean. The world of my childhood was not silent. Villages are not silent places. There were animals and weather, and the sounds of people working and children, and the general noise of a community living in proximity. But underneath all of that, there was a ground of quiet that is simply gone now, and has been gone for decades. A baseline stillness that you could find in the early morning or the late evening, or in the fields outside the village. A quiet that had existed since before there were people to notice it. The first motors took the quiet. Then the aeroplanes, even flying high and distant, put a new sound in the sky that had never been there before. The wireless put sound in every room. The speed of everything accelerated in a way that had its own noise, not always audible, but felt. A kind of pressure, a constant low urgency that the world of 1872 did not contain, and the world of 1974 cannot escape. I do not say this is only bad. I say it is a loss, and losses are worth naming even when what replaced them was worth having. The two wars. I cannot speak about the change in 100 years without speaking about the two wars, and I find I want to say something that is perhaps not comforting, but is true. The First World War did not feel, when it began, like the kind of thing it became. It felt, in the August of 1914, like other wars had felt from a distance. Terrible, yes, but bounded. Men going to fight and returning. Countries disagreeing by military means and arriving eventually at a settlement. The thing that the war actually was, the 4 years of industrial killing, the millions dead, the whole generation of young men removed from the world as though someone had simply reached in and taken them. That was not comprehensible in advance. It was not comprehensible even as it was happening. I had a brother who went in 1915. He came back in 1919, and he was back in the body sense, standing in my hallway in November in a coat that was too large for him, and he was not back in any other sense, and he never fully came back in any other sense, and he died in 1931 of what I will call the war, even though the death certificate said something else. The Second World War I watched as an old woman, which is a different kind of watching. When you are 67 years old and a Second World War begins, You have the first one inside you, and the watching is doubled, and the fear has a texture that younger people's fear does not have, because younger people's fear is about the unknown, and older people's fear is about the known. I am not going to tell you the world is worse than it was. I am not going to tell you it is better. I am going to tell you it is unrecognizably different, and that the experience of having been present for the entire transformation from one end to the other is something that I cannot translate into terms that carry across the distance between my beginning and my now. I was born by candlelight into a world of horses and silence. I have lived to see men walk on the moon, which I watched on a television set in a room in Birmingham in July of 1969, when I was 97 years old. I watched it with my granddaughter Margaret, who was 31, and who watched it with the eyes of a person for whom the extraordinary was simply the latest news. And I watched it with the eyes of a person who had been born into a world where the moon was only the moon, a light in the sky, ancient and unreachable and entirely itself. I thought about Edwin when they landed. Edwin, who had looked down at the channel from 2,000 feet and said it looked like a photograph of itself. I thought about what he would have said about this. I think he would have sat very still for a long moment and then said something precise and true and slightly unexpected, because that was what Edwin did, and then he would have wanted to know exactly how the engine worked. I did not cry when they landed. I was too old for certain kinds of emotion by then, or the emotion had gone so deep that it no longer reached the surface in the ordinary ways. What I felt was something closer to vertigo. The distance between the world I was born into and the world in which men walked on the moon is not a distance that can be crossed in a single life. I know that because I crossed it, and it was not a crossing that left me unchanged or always steady on my feet. Every decade brought a new world, and every new world required a new self, and the making of new selves out of the materials of old ones is the actual labor of a long life, the labor that nobody talks about because it has no name and produces nothing visible. I have made myself new so many times. I am tired. I am grateful. I do not know what comes next, and for the first time in 102 years, that is entirely acceptable to me. I have seen enough of what comes next to trust that it will be more than anyone expected and less than everyone hoped, and that somewhere inside it there will be people doing what people have always done, which is living through it, one ordinary day at a time, and making of it whatever they can. That is all any of us ever did. That is all any of us ever will.